If anybody has ever told you trains and cars, they not only come together quite often when you think about the national statistics, but it's also quite terrifying to understand that it happens so often, you really ought to wonder, does the equipment on the crossings mean nothing at this point? Well, in some cases, there just happens to be points in which that it's a total coincidence, as in, a vehicle accidentally makes contact with the train, especially when there's more than one that happens at some point. In this case, a certain accident in the UK that is now a quarter century old is still shining light and still pertains a bit of relevance, not only because it is a train versus car scenario, but also it's a case in which that left many people dead. And there are similar accidents to this, but for today, we're going to focus on what is simply titled the Selby rail crash, but it's also known by the nickname the Great Heck of 2001. As always, we'll talk a bit about the location as well as the railway equipment involved and even the line that associates with the accident itself. Starting off with the location that the accident takes place in, this is known as Great Heck, a small parish about 7 miles south of Selby in the town of North Yorkshire, England. As of 2011, with a population of 201, there aren't exactly much that you can derive from this small town itself. A couple of unique things worth mentioning though is that hatch is considered to be the Old English relative term that is roughly translated into Great Heck entirely. Also, there is the Great Heck Brewery. While not exactly as big as most other UK-based beers and other such alcoholic drinks, it still does have its place in terms of it being considered more of a local brew than a larger corporate-style brew entirely. Although, of course, while the town itself, despite being at least 140 years old given the information available, still does have certain census-related problems. Not to mention, the occupational structures that were shown from within means that there were a number of different jobs available in spite of the small population. Also, various lakes, and even a few other unique bus routes, apart from railway crossings and other such roadways, do make up the bulk in terms of traveling, whereas any other method of transportation is not so commonly available, with this being considered a bit more towards the land, and with little air-related travel situated due to having little to no airways or even an airfield from within. In terms of railway equipment associated with the accident in Great Heck, there was the combination of Freightliner, not to be confused with the truck variety commonly found within the United States as well as Canada, but its own separate railway-based company, which of course is mainly responsible for transporting freight, including hoppers and other such cars, and are typically pulled by unique Class 66 engines, including one in particular that we'll be discussing later in the video. On the other hand, there was an express passenger train, a high-speed one to be exact, operated by the likes of the GNER, or Great Northeastern Railway, which first came into the world as far back as 1996, through the combination of the Intercity East Coast Line, which ran up until 2007, and unfortunately doesn't have much relevance as of today, although it still was well known for one unique thing: the Intercity Express passenger services. The Intercity 225s, as they were commonly known as at the time, were unique train sets that were built throughout the 90s and well into the 2000s, although sometimes there were various other railways that would also go on to create their own unique Intercity 225 sets, such as the one that we'll be discussing later in the video just as well, much like with the Freightliner freight train, in effect. One last thing to mention here is that this is in fact a pretty brutal accident, so you might want to brace yourself for what's about to be taught. February 28th, 2001, at around 0600 in the morning in Great Heck, Selby, North Yorkshire, England. There was one train, known as Intercity 225 1F23, operated by the GNER, going from 0445 all the way down to over 0500, operating in conjunction from the cities of Newcastle and eventually London's King's Cross. Both of these stations were unique big stops for this exact railway train itself. Driving van trailer, Mark IV coaches, Class 91, made up for the consist of the train itself. The 225 operated in a push-pull configuration, which, similar to how engine and cab car fixations on commuters and passenger trains works in the United States, would allow for the train to be pulled or pushed on either side without having to make a turnaround on a turntable or Y-track, unlike with steam engines, that, much like in the North American region, also had to be done in the UK in order for trains to be turned around and put in the right direction. There also was a freight train, which of course was put together by Freightliner, a leading Class 66 locomotive with the number plating unknown, as well as coal wagons were situated behind, around 16 of them to be precise. Both of these trains were on their way to their said destinations, but unfortunately, a problem would ensue. A Land Rover Defender, driven by a man known as Gary Hart, would unfortunately end up leaving a certain bridge that hovered over the rail line in the Great Heck region itself. While the Land Rover unfortunately was unable to back up and ending up rather close to the tracks, Hart would end up leaving the vehicle and attempting to call emergency services in an effort to attempt to get the vehicle off the track before anything happened. But unfortunately, despite his attempts to reach emergency services, nothing could be done to prevent the ensuing chaos that was about to happen. The Intercity 225 smashes into the Land Rover. And even though Gary Hart was able to find out what had happened to what once his vehicle, there unfortunately would come worse circumstances. The Freightliner freight train would end up coming in the opposite direction and also slamming into the nearby wreckage, causing many more casualties as well as a lot more damage to occur. The damage to both trains also managed to make contact with the likes of various also points along the nearby bridge from which that Hart unfortunately fell down from with his Land Rover, and not to mention with the DVT itself that was leading the Intercity 225, as well as a majority of the 225's consist, including all 9 of the coaches. There was in fact a lot to report from investigators. There also was a good amount of cargo that had managed to come outside of the hoppers that were being carried by the Freightliner. In total, there were 10 deaths, 82 injuries, as well as a good amount of survivors whom were unfortunate enough to be involved in this terrible accident. Rescuers soon arrived on the scene, including members of the Health and Safety Executive, or HSE for short. They were among the first, alongside local authorities from the South and North Yorkshire Police, as well as the British Transport Police, or BTP. There were also the highways agencies, as well as some locals that also arrived at the scene of the crash. What they were able to find were not only a number of bodies, but there were also a few unanswered questions that came to mind, especially coming from nearby witnesses and many other personnel. how could two trains possibly have an impact like this? And more importantly, what was the deal with the Land Rover being on the tracks in the first place? Well, it turns out that there were a number of things that led up to the wreck, as well as a number of other variants that were conducted in studies by the Health and Safety Executive, as well as the Safety Commission and Highways Agency. First off, the driver of the Land Rover, Gary Hart, was going on a carriageway or a bridge that passed over the railway tracks, and ended up going just off of the road leading down towards the tracks. While this was seen as more of an accidental move that occurred, this of course did play up a big role in the double train collision that occurred, as the Land Rover would be struck first by the GNER Express, otherwise known as the 225 set, and then later the Freightliner train would slam right on into it. It was noted by investigators, especially from the HSE, that the way that the coal wagon slammed into the coaches of the 225 set was actually very similar to the freight and passenger collision in Southall, which occurred in 1997, 4 years earlier than the Great Heck disaster. Secondly, it was also noted that the extensive damage of the 225 was mainly because of the DVT, or the head-end power car, of the 225 set was more lightweight, and therefore the HSE found out the crashworthiness of the 225 was very much inadequate. The cab's separation from the underframe, as well as the lower ride height compared to the Freightliner train, allowed for them to create a thorough evaluation, and eventually, when their final report on the accident was released in December 2002, just shy of 2 years after the accident, a number of different recommendations would be found in order to make GNER aware of the many faults that the 225 set was made with. Similar things would also be noted when it came to the Freightliner, but nonetheless, through all the investigations, it mainly got back to the lack of barriers on the carriageway above the line that occurred, in which that Gary Hart's Land Rover would end up off the road and then on the tracks leading up to the collision. After the accident had occurred, a trial occurred at Leeds Crown Court, where Gary Hart was charged with death by dangerous driving, 10 counts of which that related to the 10 deaths that occurred at the time of the accident. While he did plead not guilty, there were also a few other things that had been noted, especially by prosecution. Supposedly, his lack of adequate rest had also led to him accidentally leading off the road and the carriageway in Great Heck. And there were also supposedly thoughts about the idea of internet dating that occurred, in which a phone call lasted for a few hours, 21:48 to 02:58, just shy of 5 hours, had basically allowed for him to unfortunately miss a good amount of sleep. And supposedly, in spite of the few hours he had from the time he hung up on the phone to the time of which that he would start work, he unfortunately would have little to no sleep in that same morning that he got into the Land Rover and eventually ended up onto the tracks. The combination of having little to no sleep, as well as some reckless endangerment and behavior, had unfortunately allowed for this to happen. By January 2002, he was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to 5 years in prison and even a 5-year prohibition period where he would no longer be allowed to drive legally. Since then, measures have been taken in an effort to prevent any more accidents like this from ever occurring, especially with such complicated mishaps occurring leading up to said accidents like this. There were also memorials made after the accident had occurred. There was a locomotive from Freightliner itself known as Driver Steve Dunn, in parentheses, George. which actually refers to the driver of the Freightliner freight train, whom unfortunately was one of the 10 victims killed in the crash. There were also a handful of official memoriams, a garden in the East Coast Main Line, which has been around since then just as well. There were also a few pieces of GNER that were put together in the National Railway Museum in York, England. And then, of course, we can't forget to mention that by July 2002, there was a ceremony put together by the likes of John Weddell. His family, of course, had attended the funeral, by which that he was also involved in the crash. Weddell himself was also killed as a result of the double impact with the Land Rover. And today, 25 years later, there is still a good amount of recognition going into place when it comes to cars, trucks, buses, etc., going up against the likes of trains. But with an accident like this, a double collision resulting in a vehicle ending up on the tracks, while it's not necessarily as common as just simply a train hitting a car or truck or bus on a crossing or etc., it's still worth mentioning that we have covered accidents like this before. One such case that had gotten popular over time was Chipman Lamont, which of course occurred in 1960, 41 years before the likes of Great Heck. And today, we are hopeful that an accident like this never happens again, because hopefully, drivers know much better than to end up on any place, such as the tracks, which they're very likely to end up roadkill.